Hello, everyone, and welcome to the video for Math 8, Lesson 9. This video is going to deal with Chapter 6, Section 4, which is on page 236 in the book. And this section has to do with simple interest, okay? And when you deal with simple interest, you're dealing with loans and savings. So in the real world, when you go out to buy a car, you go out to buy a house, take out a loan to do whatever. Technically, I guess, student loans if you plan on going to college. All loans are subject to interest, okay? Same thing with savings account. You open up a savings account at a bank, your savings account will actually draw interest. So let's actually talk about what interest is. In this case, we're going to just look at what we call simple interest, okay? But what is interest? Okay, well, interest, which I'm going to underline here the letter I, because that's going to become important here in just a few minutes. But interest is money paid or earned for the use of money. Okay, and you can kind of think of interest as kind of like a tax. Okay, and the way it works as a tax is it always increases the amount of money that you have or the amount of money that you owe. Okay, so in terms of loans, the interest in a loan is how much more money you have to pay back. Okay, interest in terms of a savings account is how much more money that you earn, how much more money gets put into your account. Okay, so interest is basically like a tax. So basically, when you borrow money, you have to pay a little bit extra to give the person who's giving you money incentive to even give you the money. Okay, so same thing with savings account. The bank wants you to put money in your banking account so that way they have money to use in their, you know, uh, transactions during the day. Okay, so when you put money into a bank, they kind of use your money to give out other loans and things like that. Okay, so when they do that, they give you a little bit of a profit on it. So that's the interest that you earn in a savings account. They put more money into your account than what you have. Okay, so with that, that's what interest is. Okay. Now, how do you calculate interest? Well, you need to know three different things in order to calculate the interest. First off, you need to know what the principal is. Okay. And I'm going to underline the letter P here. Once again, it's going to be important here in just a second. Okay. But anyways, the principal. No, this isn't the principal of a high school or principal of any school there. Once again, in math, we kind of borrow words from English, which we use words from English, which might mean something else out of a math sense. So in this case, if we're talking about math, we're talking about money. The principal is the initial amount of money borrowed or deposited. So in terms of the loan, it's how much money you actually borrow from the bank or from somebody. Okay. And then in terms of a savings account, it's how much you deposited initially in the savings account. Okay. And when we work the problems, it'll be clear what we talk about when we're talking about the principal. Okay. So if you need to think about the word principal, think of principal as meaning like top thing or the first thing. Okay. So it's the first or initial amount of money that you either take out for a loan or you deposit into your savings account. The interest rate, notice here I'm underlining the R, not the I for interest, but the R for rate, okay? Interest rate is the percent, okay? So I've got it in capital letters here. That means it's important. It's the percent the principal increases, so we kind of have a percent increase, okay? The principal increases over a certain amount of time. And as you'll see here in just a second, I put beside of this years. Normally, we calculate time in years when we're talking about loans and savings accounts, okay? So we're talking about interest. But once again, the main thing here is the interest rate. Rate is a percent, okay? So it's actually the percent it increases over a certain amount of time. Like I said, it's going to be very clear what we're going to plug in for the rate and why we have the R underlined here, but you need to focus on that word percent. Rate, in our case, for interest is percent, okay? And lastly, you need to know the time. Okay, so what I mean by time here is the amount of time you borrow the money or that you have the savings account open. Okay, so once again, we usually calculate the time in years. When you're calculating simple interest, the time has to be in years. Okay, so in that case, when you have an amount of time, as we'll discuss when we get later on in the examples, you need to know how to convert, if you need to, months to years, weeks to years, days to years, and so on. Okay, so we'll talk more about that once we get to the end, towards the end of the examples. So, but once again, it has to be in years, and what we're going to underline here is the T for time. Okay, so let me fix that T a little bit there. Make it a little nicer. I don't want people to think that this is an I that I've got going on here, an I. So we have T for time. Let me squiggle a little bit. Squiggle all these so that way people don't think that that's an I as well. So time, think of the T, okay? Now, why did I underline all these letters? Why did I underline all these words or letters? Well, in the next slide here, we have the formula. But first off, let's describe what we're even calculating here, okay? So this whole section is called simple interest, okay? There is another type of interest called compound interest, which is something that hopefully you'll learn about in a personal finance class, or later on, and maybe like later on algebra class or something, where um, you learn about the different type of interest. All we're worried about in this case is what we call simple interest, okay? And simple interest is the money paid or earned only on the principal, okay? So we're not worried about, how much money you have after 5 years and then using that to calculate what you have after 10 years, or anything like that. So all we're worried about is the principal, okay? So when we look at the formula, that's what we're calculating when we use this formula, simple interest. So the formula is I, which once again stands for interest, equals P, which stands for, in this case, principal. And this is the place where a lot of people need to be careful. The P does not stand for percent in this situation. It stands for principal, okay? So P times R, which is the rate, which is the percentage, okay? R times T, which is time, okay? And once again, that has to be in years. So we have I equals PRT, or I equals P times R times T, where once again, I is the amount of interest, so how much your loan or how much your savings account increases money, okay? So that's in dollars. The principal, which is the initial amount in your loan or in your savings account, which is also in dollars. The rate, which is in percentage, so it's a percentage rate. And then time, which once again has to be in years. If we don't have it in years here, then the calculation we get will be incorrect, okay? So if you know the formula, that's all you really need to answer the types of questions we're going to be looking at here in this section, okay? So I do have to say this is a formula that you will most likely have to know and have to memorize, okay? This is not a formula that is on the formula sheet, but once again, kind of like in previous sections, the more we use it, the more we practice with it, hopefully it'll be a formula that's easy for you to remember. Interest is equal to the principal times the rate times the time. I equals PRT. I equals PRT, okay? So let's go ahead and jump into some examples here. So example 1, finding the interest earned, or finding interest earned. So you put $500 in a savings account. The account earns 3% simple interest per year. So this is actually a two-part question. So we're going to answer part A here, part A on the next slide. But part A asks what is the interest after 3 years? So if you remember our formula, we have I equals PRT. Okay, So what I always like to do, and this will help you keep your number straight here, is I go down through here and I write down what I'm looking for and what I know. So what we are looking for here is the interest. So we don't know what I is. We're looking for I. So that means from our information in our question, we should know what P, R, and T are. So we should know what the principal, the rate, and the time is. So if we go on the principal, so P, well, the principal, once again, is how much we initially put into the savings account, okay? So how much did we put into the savings account? We put $500, okay? So that's going to be our principal. Once again, it's how much you put into the account, okay? So you can think of P being principal, meaning how much you put into the account or how much is put onto the loan, okay? Next, we have R. Well, once again, you got to remember here, R is actually going to be the percentage in these questions, okay? Because we're talking about a rate. So it's 3% per year, okay? So what that means is you're going to increase the amount in your account by 3% every year, okay? So we go here. Interest rate is the percentage, so it's 3%. And lastly, and this is the easiest thing to recognize, but as you'll see in a later example, it might get a little difficult to actually get the right number here. But in this case, what is the interest after 3 years? So the time that you're wanting to talk about here is 3 years. So in this case, we don't know I, we know P, R, and T, so we plug into our formula. So we have I is equal to P, which is 500, times R, which is 3%. But once again, we've got to remember, we got to write our percentages as decimals, okay? If we're plugging it into a formula, we're plugging it in to multiply, you have to change your percentages to decimals, okay? So that's 0.03, 0.03 times, in this case, 3 years. So if we do all that together, we get I, or the interest, is equal to 500 times 0.03. Okay. Let's see. 500 times 0.03. And then times 3. So 500 times 0.03. If we do order of operations here, we get technically go from left to right. So 500 times 0.03 is 15 times 3. And then 15 times 3 is equal to 45. But once again, we're looking for interest, so this is $45, okay? So the interest, so just the interest after 3 years is $45. And that's actually it. That's all we have to do is if we know P, R, and T, we plug them in and solve for what we don't know, which in this case is I, okay? But let's actually have a look at the next question. So let's remember, interest is $45, okay? That's the interest. That's how much extra that you're going to have in your savings account at the end of the 3rd year, okay? So if we go to the next question, it says, what is your balance after 3 years, okay? And it's kind of assuming that you leave the $500 in there. You don't touch it, okay? You don't withdraw money or anything. But if you have $500 in there, you're going to still have your $500 in your savings account. But on top of that, and this is why interest is a good thing in terms of savings accounts, is you're going to have that $500 plus the $45 in interest after the 3 years. So your balance after 3 years is actually going to be $545. Okay? So you will have the 500, okay, from what you already put into the savings account, so they don't take that away from you, okay? You actually leave that in there, and since you have your money in the bank, they actually way you can think about it as interest, they actually kind of pay you to have your money in the bank, okay? In this case, after 3 years, they pay you $45 to have that $500 in the bank. So in total, you will have $545. But I do want to say, be careful and understand, so kind of like what we had with taxes and tips and things, make sure you pay attention to the question. Notice the difference here. Here they were only asking for how much interest there was. Here they're asking you for your total balance. So in this case, make sure you know what the question is asking. So know what the question is asking. Okay. Because once again, they could just ask you for the interest, or they could ask you for the total balance on your loan or in your savings account. Okay. And we'll see the difference as we go through with practice. Okay. But let's go ahead and go on to example 2. Example 2, very similar example here, except in this case, instead of finding the amount of interest, we're finding the interest rate, which once again, I give you a little heads up here that means we're looking for the percentage, okay? So we're looking for what R is. We're looking for the rate, okay? So let's read the question. You put $1,000 in an account. In this case, they're assuming it's a savings account, okay? The account earns $100 in simple interest in 4 years. So the question is, what is the annual interest rate, or what is the interest rate for this savings account? Okay. So once again, first things first, let's write down our formula. I equals PRT. Okay. So let's figure out what of this that we know. So I just usually like to go down the list here. So do we know what the interest is? Well, the account earns $100 in simple interest, so $100 in interest. So the interest we actually know is $100. Okay, well, what about P? Do we know what the principal? Do we know how much we started with in our account? Well, we put $1,000 in our account. Okay, so how much we're starting with in our savings account is $1,000. Okay, so we know what P is. We know what the principal is. Do we know what R is? Do we know the interest rate? Well, no. That's what we're asked to look for here. So we do not know the interest rate. So that gives us a hint that we're actually going to solve this equation or solve this formula for R. Okay, so but let's go on and figure out the last one. So the last one we have is T. Well, do we know how much time is going to be passing? Okay, well, in this case, they tell you 4 years. Once again, very important to make sure that your time is in years. So 4 years. Once again, we know 3 out of the 4 variables here. So all we've got to do is plug in and solve for what we don't know. Okay, so in this case, I is going to be 100. P is 1,000 times R, which is what we're looking for, times T, which is 4. Okay, so when we do this, okay, and this is a little bit of a tricky part, so you got to pay attention here, is we have the 100 on this side. But what we can do, and this is due to what we were going to call, and you'll learn about this a lot more next year in algebra, is the commutative property. If we multiply things together, we can actually flip them around and it'll still be the same. So what I mean by that is we can rewrite this as 1,000 times 4 times R. Okay, so we can flip the R and the 4 here. So we can actually do 1,000 times 4. So that's going to be 100. 1,000 times 4 is 4,000 times R. And then lastly, kind of like what we've done before with the percent equation, is we have a number is equal to a number times a variable. So we want to solve for R. Well, what are we doing to R? We're multiplying times 4,000, so we need to divide by 4,000. But if we do something to one side, we got to do it to the other since this is an equation. Okay, the 4,000 the 4,000s here cancel out, so we're left with R. Well, what is 100 divided by 4,000? Once again, if you're a little clever with it, it's going to be the same as doing 1 divided by 40 because you have 2 zeros here. But once again, don't expect everybody to be able to do this in your head. If you need to, double check yourself. Do 100 divided by 4,000 or 1 divided by 40, and you get that this is 0.025. Now, once again, we got to remember, what are we asking for? The interest rate. Well, the interest rate should be a percentage, okay? So this 0.025, we need to now turn it back into a percentage, or turn it into a percentage. So we move the decimal place 2 places over. So we get 2.5%. Okay, so our answer here for R is 2.5%. So that savings account that you have has an interest rate of 2.5%. Okay, and once again, all we did was we plugged in what we knew from the question and we solved for what we didn't know here. So we solved for R, okay, which we ended up seeing is 0.025, which is, if we move the decimal place over 2 places, that's 2.5%. Okay. Now, when we go to number 3, this is going to be very similar, except for, first off, we found interest. Now we found R, so we found I, we found R. Well, now let's look at an example where we got to find T. So we got to find the amount of time something was in an account. Okay, so this one's a little bit different in terms of they give you a little bit extra to do at the beginning. So let's actually read the question and understand what it's saying here. Okay, a bank offers 3 different savings accounts. Okay, and that's what each one of these is representing. So here's a savings account, here's a savings account, here's a savings account. Okay, the simple interest rate is determined by the principal. Okay, so that's what this is telling you down here. This is saying if your principal is less than $500, you're going to have a 1.5% interest rate. If your principal is between $500 to $5,000, your interest rate is going to be 2%. And if you have a deposit, or if you have a principal of more than $5,000, your interest rate is going to be 3%. Now, in terms of a savings account, you always want the higher interest rate because that's going to end up giving you more money for having money in your account. Okay, so you want to get this one, but let's read the question and see what's going on here. How long does it take an account with a principal of $800 to earn $100 in interest? So this $800 tells us what the principal is. Well, which savings account are you going to be able to get with a principal of $800? Well, $800 is between $500 and $5,000. So that tells us we're going to end up with a 2% interest rate. Okay? So that's the savings account that we're going to have here because we deposited $800. They give us the savings account with a 2% interest rate. Okay. So on top of that, they tell you that you want to know how long it takes to get $100 in interest. Okay. So once again, we have our formula. I equals PRT. We know what I is supposed to be. I, in this case, is the $100. Okay. They want to know how long it takes for $100 in interest to be made. Okay. The P we know is $800. Okay. From the principal. Principal is $800. The R we actually know is now, this is why this question's a little bit different in that you had to figure out what the interest rate was first. In this case, it is going to be 2% because it's in this range. Okay, $800 is between $500 and $5,000, so that's going to give you 2.0 or 2% interest rate. And lastly, what are we looking for? Well, we're looking for the amount of time. So how long? Okay, you see how long here? That's asking for an amount of time. Okay, so we're looking for time. So when we plug in, we know I is 100. We know P is 800. We know R is 2%, but once again, we need to write that as a decimal, so 0.02, okay? And then lastly, times the T, which is what we're looking for. So now we got to simplify a little bit and then solve for T. So we can do 800 times 0.02. Once again, not something I'd imagine people will be able to do in your head, but if you're clever about it, you might not need a calculator, but double check yourself. 800 times 0.02 is actually 16. And then we're looking for t. Well, what are we doing to t? We're multiplying times 16, so we need to divide by 16. So 100 divided by 16 gives us 6.25 is equal to t. Once again, same as what we've done before, solving for a variable on one side we don't know. We always want to do the opposite. So multiplying times 16, that means we need to divide by 16. But here we've got a weird number, okay? We got 6.25, but we've always said the time is in years, okay? So that's 6.25 years. Now, normally when we talk about years, we don't talk about halves of years or 0.25s of years, okay? So what this would be, and this goes into what we're going to talk about in an example here in just a few minutes and at the very end of the video, is if we have 2.5 years or 6.25 years, well, that's 6 years and 0.25 years. Well, how much is 0.25 of a year? Well, that's a fourth of a year. So what happens when you want fourth of a year? Well, how many months are in a year? Well, there's 12. 12 divided by 4 is 3 months. So this is 6 years and 3 months. And I'll elaborate how I get this value in a different question, how I get that 3 months there from the 0.25 years, okay? But if you wanted if the question could ask you what is the amount of time in years and months. So 6.25, that's 6 years and 3 months. Okay, once again, 6 years comes from the 6. 0.25 years is 3 months because it's a fourth of a year. 3 months is a fourth of a year. Okay. But once again, I'll elaborate on that once we get to the last example. But that's how you do a question about time, is you plug in I, P, and R, solve for T. All right. Let's go on to the next example. So we got 2 more examples to go here, okay, and then we'll be done with this section, okay. So example 4, finding an amount paid for a loan. So this kind of actually goes back to what we did in example 1, except for in this case we're having a loan instead of a savings account, okay. So once again, let's read the question, understand what it's saying. This is about interest, okay? So we need to pay attention to the I, P, R, and T. So you borrow $600 to buy a violin. The simple interest rate is 15%. You pay off the loan after 5 years. How much do you pay? And it's understood here. How much do you pay in total? So how much do you pay for the loan? Okay. Well, first off, once again, we see this word simple interest, or we see the word interest here, so we know we're going to be using I equals P R T. So let's see what we know of those. Do we know what I is? Well, we know the interest, okay, that's actually what we're looking for. Okay, how much do you pay for the loan? Well, how much we're going to pay for the loan is going to be the interest plus the principal, okay? And I'll talk more about that here in just a second, but the interest is actually what we're looking for here. We need the interest to answer this question, okay? Do we know the principal? Well, how much did you borrow? How much did you initially borrow for the loan? Well, you borrowed $600, okay? So the principal on the loan in this case is $600. The rate on the loan, and you'll see why I say this here in just a second, is a really high rate, actually, 15%. So if you're getting a loan for 15%, that's actually a really high rate. And it's kind of the opposite for a savings account. When you're taking out a loan, you want this number to be lower. You want this to be as low as it can be. So you want interest rates to be lower on a loan than for a savings account. So once again, it's the difference between in a savings account you making more money, and then in a loan you having to pay more money. Okay, so just keep that in mind. 15% interest rate, that's a pretty high interest rate. Okay, not the highest I've ever seen, but it's a pretty high interest rate, and you'll see why here in just a second when we calculate this. But then lastly, we know T, because how long did it take you to pay off the loan? How long did you have the loan? You had it for 5 years. which once again is a good sign here. We've got 5 is in terms of years, so 5 years. So now let's plug in what we know, solve for what we don't know. So we don't know I, but we know P is 600. We know R is 15%, which once again, 0.15. We got to change that to a decimal, times 5 years, so 5. Okay. I'm going to take a little bit of a shortcut here. Technically, you would do 600 times 0.15, then multiply that times 5. But if you're clever about it, you can actually do this multiplication all at one time. So 600 times 0.15 times 5. It's actually going to give you 450. Well, 450 what? Well, we calculated interest, so that's $450. But here's where this question gets a little tricky. This is not the answer. You do not pay $450 for the loan. If you pay the loan off, you pay the $600 that you borrowed plus the $450 in interest. Okay? So to pay off the loan, you have to pay the $600 that you borrowed plus $450 in interest. So how much do you have to pay in total for the loan? Well, that's going to be $1,050. Okay. So once again, if you're dealing with a loan, you're going to, and it's kind of the same with the balance question that we had in example 1. You're going to want to add this. It's going to increase the amount you have to pay. So it's going to increase. That's why it's a percent increase. Okay. So it's going to take your $600 and add to it $450 in interest. So in total for this violin, for the loan for the violin, you're going to have to pay $1,050. Now, why did I say 15% was a big number? Well, look how much interest you had to pay here. If you didn't pay the loan off until after 5 years, you paid over half. You actually paid, I'll go ahead and tell you paid 75% of the total cost of or you paid 75% of what you borrowed just in interest. That's a big amount, okay? So you almost ended up paying double for the violin than what you had to if you would have just bought it straight out without a loan, okay? So just be aware of that. Since it say how much in total, so this is wanting the total. How much in total do you pay for the loan? Well, it would be that you'd have to pay back the $600 plus how much ever it cost in interest, okay? And once again, same type of thing here. Be careful of the question. They could just ask you for how much interest did you have to pay for the loan. But if they want you to know how much you had to pay for the loan in total, once again, it's assumed that's what they mean by this because you don't see the word interest here, okay? How much in total you had to pay for the loan is the principal plus the interest, okay? Just like how much you have in a bank account is going to be your principal plus how much interest it is, okay? So just be aware and be careful of the question. If it specifically asked for interest, the answer would have been $450. But since it's asking for the total payoff or how much you had to pay in total for the loan, it's principal plus interest, okay? And lastly, all right, so this is the last example. This is actually one that is not in the book, okay? But I did want to go over at least one more example here because I wanted to show you a question where you had a little bit of an issue with the time, okay? And you'll see what I mean here in just a second. So in this case, and also define the principal because that's the only thing that they didn't do in the book was we found what I was, we found what R was, we found what T was, so time. Now we need to know how to figure out what the principal was, okay? So how much you initially put in a savings account or how much you initially borrowed for a loan, okay? So with this example, let's read it and understand what's going on here. So you gain $828.75 in interest on a savings account, okay? And it says that savings account has an interest rate of 6.5%. If it has been 18 months since you opened your account, what was the principal? Okay, so here's where we got to be a little bit careful. We got to really read. So reading comprehension is key here. We got to read the question and understand what information we're given and what is it that it's being asked. So in this case, we want to know what the principal is. So first things first, every one of these questions, let's go ahead and write down our formula, I equals PRT. And let's go through and see what we have. Well, do we know what the interest is? Well, you gain $828.75 in interest. So we know the interest is $828.75. Okay. Savings account. The question is asking for the principal. So what was the principal? So we do not know P. Okay, that's what we're looking for in this question. So that means we should know R and T. Well, what is R? Well, it's the interest rate, which is the percentage. That's 6.5%. And lastly, we have T. Well, here's where we run into a little bit of a problem. If it has been 18 months, so 18 months is actually our amount of time that you've had the account. Okay, so 18 months. But here's where we have the issue, okay? When we plug into our formula, so let's go ahead and plug in the other things that we know. So we know I is 828.75. We don't know what P is, so we're leaving it there. Times, we know R, once again, rate, percentage, so 0.065. Times, and here's where we got to be careful. We do not put 18 here because this is 18 months, not 18 years. So once again, we have to take this and make it into years. Okay, well, how do we do that? And this is something that I was kind of hoping that maybe people would understand how to do coming into the class. But if not, this is something you should learn about in science, converting between units of time. But in this case, if we want to know how many years 18 months is, if we have the number of months, which is 18, we can divide it by how many months are in a year. Well, this should be common knowledge at this point. There are 12 months in a year. So if we do 18 divided by 12, that's actually going to give us, that's actually going to give us the amount of years. So when we do that, 18 divided by 12, we're going to get 1.5. So what we get out of this is years. Okay, so years is what we have to plug in. So instead of 18, we need to plug in here 1.5. And once again, how I did that, if I have months, I can take the number of months and divide it by 12, since there are 12 months in a year. And then 18 divided by 12 gives us 1.5, which is how many years? Okay, so 1.5 years pretty much. Okay, but just like before, we just plug in what we know and then solve for what we don't know. So we're looking for P here. So we can do 0.065 times 1.5. Well, first let's rewrite 828.75 is equal to P times, 0.065 times 1.5. Pretty low number here, so this is another place where you got to be careful. If you plug in those numbers correctly, and once again, that's something if you need to, double check yourself on a calculator. 0.0975. Okay? But once again, we're looking for P. Well, what are we doing to P? We're multiplying times 0.0975. So that means we need to divide by 0.0975. But at the same time, we need to do that on both sides. So 0.0975. So once again, that's nothing I would imagine anybody could do in their head. But if you actually do that, it's actually a nice calculation. If you do 828.75 divided by 0.0975, we actually get 8,500. And then once again, those numbers will cancel out, leaving us with P. Since we are talking about principal here, 8,500, that's $8,500. So that means your savings account started out with $8,500. But the big point of this whole question is, this works the same as pretty much every question we did before, except, once again, we were looking for principal here instead of IRT, so interest rate or time. But the other part is time was not in years. So we had to make sure that we converted our months to years. before we plugged into the formula. Okay. So that's actually what I talk about on the next slide here. And this is the last thing for the notes here. Make sure the amount of time is in years before you plug it into the formula. Okay. If you plug in the number of months, the number of days, the number of weeks, you're going to get an incorrect answer because the interest rate is always calculated per year. Okay. So, as a little hint for you here on how to figure out how many years it is, if you know how much time it is in months, if you take the number of months and divide it by 12, that gives you the number of years. If you know how many days it is, well, how many days are in a year? 365. So we take the number of days and divide it by 365. That gives us the amount of years. Same thing with weeks. And this one's a little bit uncommon, but everybody should probably know this by now. How many weeks are in a year? Well, there's 52 weeks in a year. So what that means is if you know the number of weeks that you had a loan or had an account, a savings account open, if you divide the number of weeks by 52, that will give you the number of years. Okay. And once again, if this part's throwing you off and you don't understand what's going on here, you need to definitely let me know. Okay. So whether in class or in on email if you're virtual. So let me know if you're having trouble with this, and I can get you some help and get you some practice on converting time units. Okay. Once again, this is something you should have probably seen in maybe like a science class up to this point, or definitely probably even in a math class. But we definitely have to do this, or else we're going to get the incorrect numbers, and we're not going to calculate the interest or whatever it is we're looking for correctly if we do not have our time in years. Okay. So with that being said, that's pretty much it for simple interest. Basically, all you're doing is you're given a formula. You need to read the question. You're going to get 3 out of the 4. So you're going to get 3 out of the 4 of I, P, R, and T. You plug in what you know, solve for what you don't know. Okay. And once again, it does take a little bit of practice here because there are technically 4 different types of questions you could be asked here. Okay. So with that being said, do make sure when you're practicing, you understand reading the questions, you understand what the questions are asking. So that way, whenever you go to answer the questions, you know exactly, what you're answering. So what you're finding. So IPRT in the question. Okay. But with that being said, if you have any questions, let me know. But as always, thank you for watching.